If you could, from your perspective, explain, what it is and what it isn't, because at this moment it's become muddy because of the reporting over the cash payment that was due to Iran anyway,
Sure.
some nearly 40 years ago.
Well, let me first say that the agreement was designed and is exclusively related to Iraq's nuclear program. And the agreement was put in place with limitations, inspection, and the use of sanctions to find a way to assure that at least for 15 years, Iraq does not have the internal capacity to develop the necessary fissile material for a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not an agreement on ballistic missiles. It's not an agreement on Iran's political behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an agreement on Iran and human rights, Iran and the Middle East, Iran and Israel, Iran and Saudi Arabia. All of those are outside the scope of the agreement. Those of us who worked on the Iran agreement in one way or another and followed it closely, and we had no role in negotiating, but the people who negotiated, we all had a hope that as that agreement came into fruition, and as it is complied with, it will begin to open up other possibilities. We haven't seen a lot of evidence of that yet, but nevertheless, that remains out there as a possibility.
There was a little bit of consternation last year when nearly 50 senators, Republican senators, had sent a letter to the Iranian government.
47, the famous
47.
Cotton letter.
That's correct. And actually Senator Alexander, neither Senator Alexander nor Corker had signed that letter.
And I admire Tennessee for that.
We wrote an editorial admiring them for that as well.
Good for you. You wanted to talk about a specific issue, the payments.
Mm-hmm.
My own view was that it was not well managed by the administration. But as a result of the Algiers agreement, in which our hostages were returned, it was agreed that differences between Iran and the United States relating to financial matters left over from the Shah's departure, and principally on the Iran side, money paid to the United States for things like military equipment, would be litigated in a court in The Hague, and decisions made about which country owed which amount of money to the other. And the money that was paid, the $400 million, was money that Iran under the Shah had paid the United States for military equipment. And the additional whatever it was, $3 or $7 billion, I don't remember, was the interest on that money as adjudged by the court. And my sense was that the decision of the court had taken place about the time the implementation day had been reached in the agreement, and the implementation day was a trigger for the return of U.S. people being held by Iran. And so that conjunction of events was portrayed by the press. The original, I think, was the Wall Street Journal, as somehow a ransom paid. It was Iran's money. It was owed in accordance with an arbitral decision which the United States agreed to in the Carter administration, but also pursued and implemented under the Reagan administration, and was designed, obviously, to deal with the outstanding financial problems between the U.S. and Iran.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for that. Going back to the actual deal, and you said what it is not. It's not a ballistic missile agreement. If we could go a little bit further into what it is, what are the key points that people need to understand what it does?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The key points that I think people need to understand about what it does is that, as I said, it involves limitations, inspections, and sanctions. The key points about the limitations was that focus of attention was on the fissile material that Iran might be able to make a nuclear weapon. And it takes two forms: highly enriched uranium, which is done through a process of using centrifuges to increase the amount of the fissile isotope of uranium, U-235, you may have heard about that, which appears in natural uranium as a small amount of a larger isotope U-238. And by using the centrifuges and spinning at a great rate and passing through many centrifuges, the heavier isotope can be separated from the lighter isotope. And that way you can increase the percentage. And so normal percentage for use in power production is 3.67%. We usually say less than 5%. The percentages for use in nuclear weapons run between 80 and 90. And so everybody was concerned that once Iran learned how to use centrifuges to enrich, which is not an easy process to master, they could quickly take this uranium, either natural uranium or low enriched uranium, and boost it up. And prior to the agreement, over say 8 years, Iran had gone from 168 centrifuges to 20,000. And so the agreement limited Iranian centrifuges to 5,100. But more importantly, it limited the amount of low enriched uranium that Iran could hold to 300 kilograms. And that limitation stays on for 15 years. And that meant that 300 kilograms of low enriched uranium did not provide enough low enriched, which if taken to highly enriched uranium would produce enough material for a single weapon. So that was very important. The second area was plutonium, which nobody pays much attention to. But with respect to plutonium, Iran was building, but had not yet completed, a nuclear reactor that burns up uranium. And in the course of burning up uranium, the spent fuel contains plutonium. Plutonium does not occur in nature. It is a product of burning uranium in a reactor. The reactor they were building, we believed, was optimized for making plutonium. And so we were very concerned. Iran agreed that the centerpiece of that reactor, which was critical for its production of plutonium, would be removed and filled with concrete. And a new centerpiece that would be put in, rather than allow them to make enough plutonium perhaps in a year for a weapon, would only make 1 kilogram as opposed to 8. And they agreed they would export the plutonium in the spent fuel when they made it. And they also agreed that they would not undertake the very difficult but not impossible process of chemically separating out the plutonium from the spent fuel in which it is made. And they agreed they would not do that as a commitment for 15 years, but they said they had no future intention ever to separate plutonium. So those meant that the two ways to make fissile material for weapons were essentially put under very tight control. The inspection and monitoring involved the UN International Atomic Energy Agency. They were given access to all of Iran's nuclear facilities, as well as access with the potential for a time delay up to 20 days to facilities they believed they ought to inspect, but were not included in the list of Iran's nuclear facilities. And this was, despite the fact that people thought that 20 days was a problem, was a real advance, because the international standard was people could have access under a special agreement with the IAEA, but there was no time limit. So the time limit was introduced in the Iran agreement to tighten the agreement rather than to make it loose. And I think that's important. In addition to that, the IAEA has cameras and seals, and it looks continuously at the process. In addition to that, not just the nuclear pieces of the process, but the centrifuges themselves and their construction is under IAEA supervision. And there are limitations on centrifuges, which essentially go out 10 years for the development of any number of centrifuges, and 5 years with more limitations on new technology in centrifuges. I think finally, Iran is subject to a special arrangement in which the 6 parties who negotiated with Iran, each one has a veto on Iran's importation of anything for their nuclear program which that party feels may contribute to the military portion of the program. That's a very new, unique set of arrangements. And so the monitoring and inspection arrangements are very unusual, very extensive, perhaps more than it ever has been. Finally, the sanctions. The sanctions are very important in bringing Iran to the table, but not exclusively so. President Ahmadinejad had badly managed their economy. They've had sanctions on since 1979 over human rights, support for terrorism, and opposition to a Palestine-Israeli settlement in the Middle East. But it was in the last 6 or 8 years that the UN and the United States pioneered new, more restrictive sanctions against Iran. And together with the drop in the oil price, they, I think, helped to convince Iran that a negotiated solution was better than not having a negotiated solution. And the sanctions are, the nuclear sanctions, those of the last 8 years, came off with respect to the agreement. Now, people in the United States do not know that no American firm, even after the sanctions came off, is allowed to deal with Iran, except the aerospace industry, which is a special exception, because Iranian planes were kind of dropping out of the sky. So it's a humanitarian exception for civil planes only. And both Airbus and Boeing have benefited from that, although no license has yet been issued for a final deal between the two, between Airbus or Boeing and Iran, but it looks like that might happen. The second thing is Iran is not allowed to use now American dollars for any transaction. And that's controlled by our having put before the world banking community that if you don't obey our sanctions, you can't do business in the US, as opposed to using dollars and doing business in Iran. This has meant that the sanctions have come off very slowly, that those who said Iran would immediately get $150 billion from the United States, it's its own money, were totally wrong. About between $4 and $6 billion in the 9 or 10 months of implementation has gone to Iran up until now. Maybe a little bit more, but not the kind of huge sums. And there's no evidence that I know of that Iran has spent significant amounts of this money on playing games in the Middle East. In fact, if anything, Iran probably clearly went along with the Russian-US ceasefire deal in Syria, despite the fact it's not holding up. And that's not, in my view, Iran or Russia's fault. We unfortunately bombed Syrian troops by mistake. But nevertheless, it's important to understand that the sanctions thing has not resulted in the feared bonanza that would come. I think overall, perhaps $50 to $100 million of Iran's money was actually tied up by sanctions. I think quite clearly Iran owed in debts 50 billion, of this. And the other 50 billion, as I said, has flowed very slowly. Finally, there are real problems with the European banks wanting to deal with Iran because they fear that the US will scrutinize them very carefully and find any little mistake in their due diligence as a basis for fining them. As you know, we fined a French bank, I think, $6 billion for violating Iran sanctions. So the fear is it. The truth is that Secretary Kerry and Secretary Liu have been saying to the European banks, if you do careful due diligence and you make a mistake, we're not going to take it out against you. That the sanctions are off. We think you have every right to do business. The problem is, in my humble view, that there are 3 exigencies that we can't guarantee anybody's banks against. One is if President Trump tears up the agreement. The second is if the Republican Congress tears up the agreement. The third is if Iran violates the agreement, then under the terms of the agreement, the UN sanctions, which cover everybody, come back on automatically. And therefore, if you're a bank and investing in Iran or financing trade, and you have some fear that one of these actions will nullify the agreement, then what happens to your money?
Absolutely.
So those are serious concerns.
Yeah, I've been very curious when you talk about the scope of the agreement going from 20,000 centrifuges to 5,100. In your experience, and I'm not sure how involved you were, had the information that you've had to determine how the negotiation was done, when you start a negotiation like that, does, for example, the U.S. and the other countries start at zero? So 0 centrifuges versus 20,000, and how does it get to that
No,
point?
I think we started at a number around 1,500 from my experience. The important thing was that there's an interrelationship between the number of centrifuges and the amount of material you're allowed to produce. And the Iranians wanted a larger number than we were prepared to offer, but agreed that they would not produce a very significant amount of low enriched uranium as a result. So we said, okay, we can go up to 5,100. That was the final negotiated figure. I think they started at 9 and we started at 1,500. But they agreed only 300 kilograms would be produced, which is the most significant figure because, as I said originally, that limits the amount that they could rapidly enrich to make fissile material for a weapon.
And I think that oftentimes the conversation has gone into Iran saying that it's using this for peaceful nuclear power options, and this is why they continue to produce this.
They do, although at the moment, Iran has no reactor for which they have no fuel. In other words, the only peaceful power reactor the Iranians have is a reactor at Bushehr, originally built partly by the Germans, and then we persuaded the Germans to stop. Then later contracted for by Russia, and Russia took a very long time to do it, which I think was quite helpful. And the Russians will not sell a reactor unless two things are attached to it. They provide all the fuel, no reason for anybody else to make fuel, which keeps them out of the enrichment business. And they take back all the spent fuel, which has the plutonium in it, so people can't use the spent fuel to separate plutonium for military purposes. Now, the Russians have contracted to build 2 more reactors at Bushehr, but under the same conditions. The Iranians have a reactor provided by the United States to the Shah, which is now being used to make isotopes for medical purposes. That reactor requires 20% enriched fuel. And so the fuel for that reactor is coming from outside. But the Iranians are making this 300 kilograms of low enriched fuel, no more than 3.67%, to keep their hand in and to provide, I think, for some other small uses they may have. But it's a very small amount of fuel and it's a very small amount of activity.
And at this moment, what is your sense of being able to, certainly you brought up the scenario of a President Trump, you brought up the scenario of Congress setting up this agreement. In terms of the third exigency, you mentioned Iran. What assurances are that they will follow through on
It's
this?
very important to note that beginning after the original agreement, which was a partial agreement that was signed in November 24th, 2013, and lasted until the comprehensive agreement was implemented beginning in January, I think, of this year. And since that agreement, the comprehensive agreement's been implemented in the regular reports of the IAEA, some quarterly, I think some monthly, there has never been any indication that Iran is not complying. There have been a few areas where there have been differences of interpretation, and there is a commission that includes Iran and the other 6 negotiating powers, and they have worked out the answers, all to our satisfaction, and all of which Iran has complied with.
From a philosophy of international relations, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that and your experience, because oftentimes you have actors that aren't always friends, enemies, allies, and it tends to get very simplified.
Sure.
I know that there's a school of thought that Game of Thrones is a great teacher of international relations, but in looking at the world as it is, that real world, how do you go to understand the relationships that the United States have? Because obviously we have a relationship with China, despite also some occasional adversarial positions that we have with them.
The United States has relations with 180, almost 190 countries. It's rare that we have a perfect relationship. So we have problems. That's why we have diplomats. And diplomats tend to work out those problems. The other day, I set out 8 or 10 things in which we have cooperation with the Russians, or we had cooperations which we could continue. Things like Iran, the Northern Distribution Network, which is the military way of supplying Afghanistan overland through Russia and Central Asia, the Arctic Council, now potentially Syria, more or less. We cooperate with the Russians on terror. We cooperate with the Russians on counter-drug. The Russians continue to help us on the International Space Station, for example. So those are examples of things that we have continued cooperation with the Russians on. We have serious differences over Ukraine, Crimea, of Russian posture, particularly vis-a-vis a sphere of influence. The Russians don't like the expansion of NATO. They don't like the development of bases in the expanded NATO area in which the US uses those bases, either temporarily or permanently. The Russians believe that we are committed not to put nuclear weapons in the expanded area. We haven't done that. The Russians are unhappy about our creation in Romania and Poland of missile defense facilities, even though, in fact, we have tied those to a detection system and a set of arrangements which, as far as we can see, are more friendly to the Russian concern that this would be a readily expandable ballistic missile network that would threaten their deterrent capability, which is what they claim they're most concerned about. My view is that the Russian view is quite exaggerated, and that the Russian remedy is to be able, in effect, to turn off our ballistic missile system when they want. The answer, in my view, to that is that we ought to share information about the present picture as the basis for our cooperation together, and that we ought to be able to give them an assurance that we're not going to expand this system. There is an interesting Russian question. You built this system because you were concerned about Iran. You've now got an Iranian nuclear agreement. Are you still concerned about Iran? So there are differences there. My sense is the dialogue is not rich enough to get through those questions. And some of that has reflected personality clashes between President Putin and President Obama. And whether the next president, whoever it is, will have a different relationship or could help to open up the relationship to have the kind of talks that are necessary to deal with these problems, I don't know. But my view is it's important to think about that and to see whether, in fact, something like that can be done. In many ways, having been a diplomat through the Cold War, my sense is that we spent most of the Cold War with the Soviet Union trying to put in place steps and activities that built stability and security at the same time, so that we would be less victims of accident, miscalculation, and misjudgment with respect to the nuclear deterrent, recognizing the tremendous consequences that could come from that. The Cuban Missile Crisis came close on that, but we've had other sets of circumstances where we've had accidents that could have led to miscalculation. In one, President Yeltsin was brought a message that the US was attacking when the Norwegians had launched what are essentially sounding rockets into the upper atmosphere. So the problem of miscalculation and misjudgment is real. I belong to the school that thinks that we need to get rid of launch on warning. That if both of us do, we'll both be safer, and neither of us will have an advantage over the other.
David McCullough's John Adams, there's a quote that's attributed to Ben Franklin, who said, "A diplomat listens much and talks little." And I'm wondering, what is your philosophy as a diplomat? How do you
Well,
approach it?
my view has always been, as I gave speeches in which I said I violated my premise, that two-thirds listening, one-third talking was about right, but I'm not doing very well with you either.
No, this has been fascinating for me. I mean, just to
Yeah.
learn from you and,
Yeah.
and learn from those experiences. And the reason I ask that is because in approaching a deal like that, something that where you have to be intent on seeing what are these incremental steps to creating the stability, as opposed to seeing these massive swings. As we've heard the bravado of political communication that, we're going to tell the Mexicans what to do, we're going to tell the Russians what to do, and it seems counterproductive.
It is, and it doesn't get you very far. On the other hand, I think particularly with the major powers, it's important for us to look at things where we have a strong mutual interest. Because working with them on things where we have a strong mutual interest, the Soviet Union, we had a strong mutual interest in avoiding a nuclear war. And we put together a lot of things that helped to stabilize the deterrent, build down the size of the forces, consolidate the weapons and nuclear material, so that the problems of accident or theft or other things were, in my view, being dealt with. At the moment, given the differences with President Putin, he seemingly doesn't want to talk about next steps. And I think we should be thinking about trying to overcome that. With China, interestingly enough, in an entirely different way, we have a lot of common interest in climate change. The Chinese are seriously concerned. Chinese have probably done as much with wind and maybe solar as anybody. And they're looking for alternative ways, even though they are still heavily reliant on coal. And they certainly haven't given up coal because they see the long-term future economic growth heavily dependent on that. But they're moving from an export-dependent economy to a domestic demand-driven economy. And they're seeing already reductions in rapid growth rates, so they can adjust. And I think we ought to be working with them on the technology and other things to help that adjustment. And that could become some kind of a win-win for us. If you have win-wins, then the potential for negatives, particularly on what I would call second-order questions that don't affect your existence, it's easier to deal with. You can freeze them, you can put them into a place where you can take your time to try to work out the answers, rather than allow them to fester and become a centerpiece. And our issue with countries like Russia and China, where we have differences, and they're not trivial differences, but they don't affect at this stage our existence. But what would is if those differences translate themselves into postures that allow for accident or misjudgment about nuclear weapons. And we have to be concerned about that. It is also true that those capacities to work together on things that are very important to both states allows you to put a little bit closer on the back burner the smaller issues that cause you problems. I think finally, I've given you 8 questions in which we have or can continue to work with Russia. That should not be allowed to be submerged in what I call the Saturday afternoon football mentality in the US of our Russia relationship. And I'm concerned about that. And President Eisenhower was very concerned by what he called the military-industrial complex. I'm less concerned about the complex than I am of the regular drive for military budgets, which tends to have to be buttressed, and it's not irrational at all, on threats. But if you overblow the threat to build up the budget, then you're putting yourself in a political context in which you can be subject to serious dangers, in part because of the reaction of the other side, and in part because you're overstressing the conflict rather than looking at a very broad picture in which there are some areas that work and some areas that don't work. And the first way to deal with that, I think, is 3 steps. 1, shut up. And we've seen a certain amount of diminishment of verbal trading with Putin and with the president. Secondly, don't take steps that do harm, do no harm. And some of the calm that we've seen in the last 9 months on Ukraine, not total, may reflect a little bit of that, not total, not totally there. And the third is that the leaders need to talk, and they need to talk in an environment where they can be as frank as possible without a lot of outside parties playing around. One-on-one conversations, maybe with trusted interpreters.
How do you think we can change the dialogue here in the United States surrounding issues like terrorism? We've just had these series of devices found in New York, and explosions, and any one of these will turn into a media circus, at least for a short term, and create the situation of
to me, it would be very useful if we were less focused on selling the media on the basis of circuses and more focused on the media as an interpretive and educational tool. And the media is an enormous capacity to help people understand complexities. But complexities at this stage don't sell the media. But they do provide what I would call the other alternative, the kind of esteem in which you and other great papers in this country are held because you're prepared to carry the burden, if only in the editorial columns, of having a way to inform the public about the complexities and the interrelationships and the difficulties. We have the First Amendment for a reason. The simple amendment was the debate would produce truth. But the truth is that the First Amendment is also what I call an open invitation to an educational process through the media and exchange of ideas, which is designed both to inform and do their best to reflect the reality and the truth in the process. And I think the media, therefore, in return for the First Amendment, has a role. And the role is, in my view, to sell itself on the basis of honesty and straightforwardness rather than merely hype. Mm-hmm. And so you have a difference between the New York City traditional tabloids and the great papers that exist in the United States still in the print medium. We have less of that in what I would call the electronic media. Blogs tend to be more the smorgasbord from which you eat only the things you like. I think there are television shows. I have a lot of respect for the work the NewsHour tries to do in its hour to present us with the information that's going on. I tend to think NPR works hard at that. I think the more, put it this way, partisan focused electronic media less so. And I don't find blogs produce the sort of debate that's informed and helpful. A lot of it is calumny or bad language or flags that try to call attention rather than saying, here's what the truth is, and this is the reason why I believe this is the truth, this is the source, these are to analyze and give people a careful perspective. And we lack that. And a final point, you can see in the campaign how people's efforts to disregard the truth seem to be unmet, if we could put it this way, in general, by the press, who plays the role of mediator and interrogator in these questions. Let's hope the debate next Monday will be better than some of the debates we have seen already.
It'll be quite interesting. Next Monday, I'll be at Belmont as well,
Good for you.
moderating a discussion with students. It was a debate watch party, and then afterwards we're going to have a discussion about what they saw and what they didn't hear.
I have to go give a speech in California, but happily they've allowed me time to watch the debate.
That will be interesting.
Because nobody would come to my talk if we took them away from the debate. Happily.
Well, Mr. I want to thank you very much. I know we're going to be seeing each other in another hour or so, but this was a good opportunity.
I hope this was helpful to to you.
Absolutely, it was.
And if there's anything else you can think of that you'd like to talk about ahead of time, but please let me know. We've sort of gone off on a lot of different tangents, but I'm here to tell you, in response to your questions, what I think about things rather than merely rehearse some kind of, pre-canned speech. I have that.
And I appreciate it very much.
Yeah.